When the First World War broke out, the British Army was completely disinterested in the new technology of motor cars. The Automobile Association had tried to show them how they could be used by moving troops from London to Brighton. The only thing the top brass could think of was the men would need a chin strap to stop their caps blowing off. This meant it was left to the Royal Navy to muddle through the invention of the armoured car and later the tank, almost by default. As a maritime nation, the Navy had always had a glamour about it. The sight of naval armoured cars touring the streets under the white ensign proved irresistible to some. The Duke of Westminster, believed to be the richest man in the kingdom, was one of those. He personally paid to equip a squadron of Royal Naval armoured cars. A young Conservative politician called Oliver Locker Lampson tried to do the same, but without the Duke's almost unlimited funds, he had to raise the money through public subscription rather than just writing a cheque. He raised his squadron, and then Locker Lampson needed to find the men to crew it. This was made easier by the fact that any man volunteering to join the Royal Navy Armoured Car Division would join with the rank of petty officer, which was much more attractive than the Army's offer of a private's uniform and pay. Most of the naval armoured car squadrons would eventually get transferred to Army control and their men demoted. But there was an exception. Locker Lampson had heard about a Belgian unit being sent to Russia and lobbied the Russian embassy that his own squadron might follow. This was partly a way of demonstrating Britain's support for the Russian war effort, but it was also demonstrated Locker Lampson's own support for the war, and he made sure that his exploits on the Eastern Front were reported in British newspapers. By 1915, he managed to get the Russian General Staff to request his squadron, but it wasn't until October that the final negotiations were complete. While this was going on, Locker Lampson recruited another 250 men and acquired an additional 20 vehicles. The division that was sent to Russia comprised of 500 men, 50 officers, 45 cars, 15 armoured lorries and 50 motorcycles. The journey wasn't easy. They got iced in at the small port of Alexandrikov over the winter of 1915, but after the spring thaw, the division managed to get to the port of Archangel. From there, they travelled to Moscow by train, arriving at 1:30 in the morning on the 5th of June. They were inspected by Grand Duchess Elizabeth, the sister of the Tsarina, and a Russian band that insisted on playing every verse in the British national anthem, including some that no one had ever heard before. Then Locker Lampson gave a speech to his men, and to the reporters, a speech about how they were going to maintain the prestige of British arms on the Eastern Front. Their unfamiliar uniforms led to some confusion in Moscow. Two petty officers ended up taking the salute of an infantry regiment that was being reviewed in what is now Red Square. One of these same petty officers would later remark that Russian soldiers were treated more or less like animals by their officers. Russian soldiers had basically no rights. There were petty restrictions heaped upon them, such as having to keep your hand at the salute or being addressed by an officer. A Russian officer actually tried to hit a man of the Russian Royal Naval Armoured Car Division for not saluting him, only to be hit back so hard that he was launched through a display case of paint strays. The first opposition they faced was not from the Germans, but from the British ambassador in Petrograd. He had assumed that only the cars were being sent, and not the men to crew them. The Royal Naval Armoured Car Division was now technically part of the Russian army, even though its supplies came from the Admiralty. This put him in the awkward position of having to ask for information from the Russians about what was in reality a British division fighting on Russian soil. Despite this, the naval men were allowed to march through Moscow on 7th of June with their bayonets fixed. Flowers were thrown at them from open balconies, and they were given a farewell banquet in the summer gardens before marching to the railway station to begin their journey to Transcaucasia to fight the Turks. But first they had to get there. The detachment was soon affected by an outbreak of dysentery, which killed one of the petty officers and led to the medical officer issuing a warning not to eat too much of the local fruit. A second petty officer died from food poisoning after eating bad fish, and this was also around the time they saw their first Turk, a severely wounded prisoner in leg irons, guarded by a sentry with a fixed bayonet. The Eastern Front was not bogged down in trenches like the West, but there were still a lot of natural obstacles before they could get to their area of operation. They'd been taking their cars through passes which had never seen a motor vehicle before, some were nothing more than tracks. So parts were so steep that the cars had to be hauled up by hand and then lowered again by ropes. Despite all of this, they managed to get to their destination 2 days earlier than expected. The cars and the crews were drawn up in a long line so they could be inspected by Grand Duke Nicholas, and a wide semicircle of curious onlookers was kept away by Cossacks. They fought in Armenia with the Russian army against the Turks and their Kurdish allies. The speed of their cars let them attack like cavalry. The heavy cars were regarded as armoured car destroyers, and they were used against villages or sandbag redoubts. In one attack, they blew up a Turkish magazine, killing over 300 Turks in the explosion. But they found that cars could not press home an attack against entrenched infantry. From here, they were transported to Romania. The combined forces of Germany, Turkey and Bulgaria were fighting against the Russians and Romanians. The British armoured cars were used to tear out behind enemy lines or wait in ambush while enemy troops left in protection of their trenches. This was not without danger. The cars were armoured, but they could still fall into a shell hole and get trapped, which is what happened to Lieutenant Ingel and his crew. The men bailed out to seek shelter as the Bulgarians poured fire into their car. The crew got separated from Ingel in the confusion, who had been knocked out by an explosion. When he regained consciousness, it was dark. He dragged himself all the way back to the Russian lines with a broken leg. Luckily he had been taught a few words of Russian, or they'd have shot him when he got there. The Royal Naval Armoured Car Division was at Tirzopol when the February Revolution broke out in Petrograd. The spirit of revolution quickly spread through the country. It even infected the naval men, who went on strike against some of the petty rules enforced against them, like not smoking on the streets. Their commanding officer, Locker Lampson, found himself the man on the centre of the action. He was asked by the Admiralty to write reports on what was going on. His report in July of 1917 on Korlinov was very complimentary. He also had a good relationship with Kerensky, who had met in Galicia, and had testimonial to the efficiency of the armoured cars by Kerensky survives in his papers. The men were not sorry when they left Tirzopol for Galicia, even if the local Russian commander was. They'd been virtually the only troops that he had been able to rely on, and the revolutionary conditions in Russia were only getting worse. In April, things got so bad the naval men stayed up all night expecting to be attacked, and this was before the July days and their involvement in the Kerensky offensive. The Kerensky offensive began on the 1st of July. It was the last roll of the dice by the provisional government that had come into power in the February Revolution against the Tsar. The plan leaned on Royal Naval Armoured Car Division and other foreign units because these were the few units that the provisional government could still trust. It began with a massive artillery bombardment. Then the armoured cars roared into action at 9:55 to clear a path for the infantry, with Kerensky himself looking on from a forward observation post. The cars sped off, only to be stopped by a barricade of sandbags that had been left across the road. Their crews jumped out, braving German fire, to clear a path for their cars. As they did, Chief Petty Officer McFarlane was hit by a shell fragment and killed. Another sailor was wounded, but they managed to clear the obstacle and charged into battle. However, the cars were found most useful covering the retreat that followed. They could rush up and down the enemy lines, allowing the infantry to make orderly withdrawal and race back to the new front lines. Locker Lampson was awarded the Order of St. Michael and St. George for the work that his squadron did on the Eastern Front. His medical officer, Staff Sergeant Gilden Scott, was awarded the Distinguished Service Order, and a number of Russian medals were given out to both them and to their men. With the Russian Revolution devolving into the Russian Civil War, Locker Lampson decided it was time to try and get his men out. A maintenance party was left with the cars, and the rest of them made their way to Archangel using the excuse that they'd been given home leave. Getting there wasn't easy. They went by railway, but they had to bribe the engine drivers to keep going. When the bribe stopped working, two petty officers took over driving the train the rest of the way. Once they got to Archangel, they found the same freighter that had brought them there waiting to take them home. The convoy weighed anchor on the 16th of October and set a course for Britain, escorted by minesweepers and an auxiliary cruiser. The voyage was uneventful, and the squadron reached Newcastle on the 29th of October. Locker Lampson was to be proven right about his choice to get his men out, as on Christmas Day the Bolsheviks took the cars that they had left behind, despite the best efforts of the small maintenance party to make them inoperable. Locker Lampson would return to politics after the war and would later hire Albert Einstein while he was on the run during the 1930s. His men would return to Russia through Iran, and other members of the Royal Naval Guard Division would be sent across the world. Next time I'm going to be talking about the Duke of Westminster Squadron and what they were doing in North Africa. If this got you interested in what the Royal Navy was doing in Russia in World War I, all of the sources are listed on our website. If not, then thank you for listening this long.